Hello, welcome back to our live coverage of the United Nations Climate Talks. You've just been watching the Q&A session with Pablo Salon, the ambassador for Bolivia to the UN here. I'm delighted to say we've been joined, well, first of all by Zaina, a co-presenter who's been out in the field for the last couple of days, and also by Stewart Maginnis, who is the head of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, if I've got my acronyms the right way around.
Director of the Environment and Development Group of IUCN.
Okay. Right, thank you very much. So we're going to talk a little bit about the progress here and also about where you think these talks can move forward. Specifically, we're going to look at forestry a little bit, but perhaps I should ask you to begin by asking what your organisation does.
Okay, well, IUCN is a union of members. We've got over 1,100 members, and those range from states like Mexico, for example, the United States, Liberia, right through to government agencies who manage national parks authorities or water authorities, forest departments, to about 850 NGOs, from big famous ones like WWF to small grassroots organisations working in Ghana or Tanzania.
And what joins them all together under IUCN? What's the common thread?
Well, conservation of nature, it's in our title, so that's and looking to ensure that we actually have a world that's a fair world that really values and conserves biodiversity and nature.
And why is climate change a big issue for you guys? Like, we hear a lot about the kinds of impacts we're expecting on people, and we hear about polar bears as well. But what other kind of impacts are you worried about?
Well, we look at this from two perspectives. One is obviously climate change is an increasing threat to biodiversity, and we're already starting to see the impacts of climate change on systems like coral reefs. Coral reef, it could be that by 2030 coral reefs worldwide are actually in long-term decline. So obviously we're concerned that climate change is going to have a real impact on the species and the ecosystems that we're seeking to conserve. The other side, though, is that nature's not just threatened, nature also offers a solution. And there's some really good options out there if we could mobilise our efforts around that would give us a quick start to deal with both mitigating climate change. That means slowing down the amount of CO2 that's going into the atmosphere, and also helping people to adapt to the impacts of climate change, because the impacts are already with us.
And is that what brings you to COP16?
Yes, exactly. So what we're doing is we're promoting a couple of key approaches that we think are really important, that the delegates need to make sure a decision is taken on and put in place a framework to allow people to take action on the ground.
And what are these approaches? What are you pushing for here?
Well, there's two main approaches that we're pushing for. Number one is what we call a nature-based solution to slowing down the amount of carbon dioxide that goes into the atmosphere, and that is primarily based around forests. You probably know, your viewers probably know, that forests contribute perhaps 17%, let's say 1/5 of all the CO2 that goes into the atmosphere comes from forest destruction, forest loss, forest degradation. So that's one option that we could slow down. If we slow down the rate of deforestation, and we could move quite quickly on that, you start to slow down the amount of CO2 that goes into the atmosphere. Equally, trees also sequester carbon, so they pull more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So you're getting a double win there. And it's interesting just to note, if you look at the first commitment period between 2008 and 2012, when the rich world agreed to some rather modest targets, they probably reduced the amount of carbon dioxide by around 2 billion tons, 2 gigatons of CO2. Brazil has been very active over that same time in trying to slow deforestation, and they probably have reduce the amount of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere by a similar amount. So if you look at all the effort that the developed world has taken, and then you look at the effort of a country like Brazil, you can see the real potential that forests offer.
I went to the Brazil Pavilion and saw their exhibition. They're using a lot of satellite data as well to help with monitoring deforestation. But what I was going to ask you is, how do these aims reflect in the talks you've been having here? So, like, specifically, what do you discuss here?
Well, there's two things that I said that we're trying to push. One is actually to get a decision that this reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, which we call REDD for short, that there will be a decision on REDD that will actually say, yep, the world is going to use REDD as a mechanism by which we can start to slow CO2 going into the atmosphere. Equally then, what we want to see is under adaptation, which we haven't talked about yet and is just as important, we want to see that natural systems are used, and that the decision is taken to allow natural systems to be used to help people, especially poor people in developing countries, deal with the impacts of climate change.
And you've mentioned the role of forests and this block of policies called REDD, reducing emissions through deforestation. As our viewers will come to realise over the course of the afternoon, hopefully, this is quite a controversial topic here, isn't it? There's some organisations who think this is going to be a real win as far as the environment is concerned, and others who are concerned about indigenous rights, people within forests, and how they might be affected by the policies. Could you try and give a brief overview of how this REDD policy works, because I appreciate that it's almost impossible to make that simple, but like, why is there controversy over this?
Okay, well, what we're dealing with is, we're not just dealing with a stick of carbon, paying someone to keep a tree on their land, and they'll so that it keeps carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. It's much more complex than that. We're dealing with issues that have been persistent problems over 30, 40, 50 years, longer in many cases. Factors that drive people to cut down forests. Some of those are economic reasons, some of those are reasons to do with poverty. And the other thing with forests are that a lot of poor people rely on forests. In fact, many governments don't actually realise how much people actually do rely on forests, but work IUCN has done has shown that typically poor people in developing countries rely on forests maybe 25 to 30% of all their income. Now, if governments put in measures to say you're not allowed to use those forests anymore, then that's 30% of a poor person's income's lost. And so that's one thing that IUCN's pushing very hard on. It's not just good enough to have REDD. We need to see REDD with strong social justice, one that respects the rights of local communities, respects the rights of indigenous people, and critically also makes sure that certain groups within those communities, particularly I'd say women, are not badly affected. In fact, hopefully that they really benefit from this.
I'll just remind our viewers, if you see me pattering away at the keyboard, this is an interactive show. We're coming to you live from the UN Climate Talks, so you can send in your comments and questions if you have any. Zaina, I think you were nudging me to ask something.
Yes. Are there any such projects on the ground now, as you described, that balance between protecting the environment and protecting the forests and ensuring the livelihoods of people on the ground?
There are some projects, but they're just starting out. There's a little bit of a longer history of people planting trees to capture carbon, but to try and stop or change land use patterns to projects that would actually encourage people not to cut down forests. There are some just getting started on the ground, but they're rather early days.
And with things like the Amazon, for instance. Most of the logging done there is illegal. So it's like illegal loggers doing it, they're kind of like pirates, right? They go in and they log, and they're very hard to track down. So how will you get to them to ask them to give them the money to ask them to stop chopping down the trees?
Well, that's a good question, and actually it's quite a complex question. It might sound simple. Because illegal logging and illegal activities happen for a whole range of reasons. Some's just sheer criminality. And obviously what you want to see there is you want to see better law enforcement. You want to see a satellite tracking that will very quickly identify where illegal activities are going. You want to see enforcement in place that will actually come down on that. Other so-called illegal activities are because poor people have been disenfranchised from the forests that they rely on. That people have, the governments, and starting way back from a colonial legacy almost, have said this forest belongs to the state, and therefore the state will decide what happens to it. And whereas people have lived in those forests, looked after those forests, benefited from those forests for a long time, and yet there's no piece of paper, there's no legal arrangement that says they've got rights over those forests. So some so-called illegal activities are actually because people don't have rights to forests, because their activities in a way have been criminalised. And so that's what RED needs to do. RED will need to differentiate where there's real criminal activity from where you have had poor people have had their rights denied, and they'll need to take different approaches to that. You'll need to make sure that poor people are actually given rights over forests, and those rights are recognised and legally enforced. At the same stage, then you need to make sure that some of the people who are doing it just to steal wood don't have that opportunity anymore.
It's complicated.
and how optimistic are you that these kind of safeguards and measures are going to be passed as part of these talks, if not here, then later on? Because and even if they are passed, how are they going to be kind of implemented on the ground? Because you have governments that have huge power, you have illegal loggers, and some of whom are criminals who presumably also have quite a lot of power in some circumstances, and then you have indigenous farmers that the most vulnerable and those who are kind of most at risk, and they have very little power. So how on earth does this get kind of implemented on the ground?
Well, to answer your question, I'm optimistic. I really do hope that we will see a deal on forests come out of these negotiations. That's not guaranteed, but I was at Forest Day yesterday where President Felipe Calderon, the President of Mexico, made a very impassioned plea for these negotiations to finalise a deal on forests. And I think there's a lot of goodwill, and it is a difficult issue, but I think we're slowly moving along there. What we need, all those questions you've asked, there's only one way to do that, and that's to get on the ground and to start to implement. But we're not implementing from scratch. We've got 30 or 40 years of experience on trying to do this. We've a lot of that experience. There's failure associated. There's also some success. I'll give you one little example that IUCN has worked with the Ministry of Natural Resources in Tanzania for over 20 years on. Northern Tanzania, there's an area called Shinyanga. It was known as the desert of Tanzania about 25 years ago. Step by step, the Ministry of Natural Resources, working with various other partners and getting some funds from the Norwegian government, started to implement a project. They started initially to plant trees, but the local people weren't that keen on planting trees. But then they started to talk to the local people and got them on side, and now you have got a large area of woodlands that have been restored. In fact, 500,000 hectares of woodlands that have been restored. Not only that, but then on the farmland, people allowed trees to come back. So now you've got an extra 1.5 million hectares of farmland, still productive, in fact even more productive now, that have more trees on it. And that's got real results for people. People have been able to send their kids to school. They've even been able to build school buildings from the profits they've made from those forests. And they've also sequestered something like 42 million tons of CO2. They didn't intend to do that, but that was another benefit as well. So we've got some really good experience that we can build on, and good experience on how you can work with communities in a very positive way to arrive at a good outcome.
I mean, it is a win-win situation for everyone. I wanted actually to wrap up by, it is time to wrap up, by asking you about the work of IUCN. So this year was the International Year for Biodiversity, and next year is forests, right?
Forests.
So could you tell us a little bit about what's going to be happening if people want to find out more about, what happens when it's the International Year of Forests?
Well, it's interesting you ask, because I've just come from a meeting with other colleagues from the World Bank and FAO and the United Nations Environment Programme. We're actually just discussing this about what we're going to do for the International Year of Forest. Now, I can't give everything away, of course, but I think we will certainly want to. Well, number one, we've got some very, very good targets that have come out of the biodiversity negotiations in Nagoya. And we've got 4 in particular that relate to forests, slowing down the loss of forests, restoring forests. That's my passion. And so we'll be trying to organise a process whereby we'll encourage governments and companies and individuals to start to think about how they can contribute to a target to restore degraded ecosystems, including forests, by 15% by 2020. So we'll be announcing something on that. We'll be profiling our colleagues at the UN have been running a film competition, and we'll be presenting some films that really show the role the forest can play in people's livelihoods. We'll be having a couple of big announcements, but you'll have to wait until February to hear those.
Well, but since you mention films, actually, let's first of all, we thank you very much for taking the time to come and meet with us. It's been a relief to have a conversation about forests that I understand without any acronyms, and I'm sure our viewers feel the same. And I joined the members of your press team to a trip to a mangrove forest, which involves restoration. It involves working with local people to living within this biosphere, balancing their livelihoods with sustainable practices, and it was just a wonderful trip. And we will leave you with this film right now.